Hello, NG Houston. So tonight we're here with the third episode of Denny's Angular Upgrade series, and we have an awesome panel tonight. So let's go ahead and introduce the panel. Oh, sorry, hold on. Okay. David, you want to say hello?
Hey, I'm Dave Owen from Thomson Reuters Tax and Accounting. I get to manage the initiative to standardize all of our products onto Angular and a series of other standardized components.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us, David. And John Bauer. John has not been on our panel tonight, so this is the first time, and we're happy to have him because John's pretty cool people. John, you want to say hi?
Hi, I'm John Bauer. I'm an instructor for Angular Bootcamp and lead developer at Oasis Digital, working on lots of various Angular projects.
That's awesome. And have you done Angular upgrades?
Yes, I have.
AngularJS to Angular? Awesome.
A couple, yeah.
Well, it'll come in handy having you here tonight. Thanks for joining us. So Sam Julian, and have you been on our panel before, Sam?
Nope, also first time.
Well, awesome. I'm glad you're here, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm coming from Portland, Oregon, and I work for a nonprofit called Energy Trust of Oregon, and I'm in the process of leading several big migrations from AngularJS to Angular, so happy to be here.
That's awesome. We really appreciate you coming. And your NG Portland is now on YouTube too? You have a YouTube channel?
We're getting there. We've had one so far.
Cool.
Little by little.
We'll keep an eye out for that. Okay, and last but not least, Denny, the star of the show.
Hi, everyone. My name is Denny. I work for Servient here in Houston, a member of NG Houston, and we are in the planning stages of upgrading our app from AngularJS to Angular. So in the midst of that, as a group, we have put together this series to help people, not just ourselves, but help all of you out there get to a place where you can also feel comfortable with the idea of planning and executing an upgrade from AngularJS to Angular. So let's go ahead and get started. Let me share my screen here. Everybody see that?
Yep.
Okay, so tonight we're in the fourth session. It's just the third part, but it's the fourth session of our process. It's when we want to talk about refactoring your AngularJS mind. And that, our series, we've been through these 3 steps in the past few weeks. We started a few weeks ago just talking about the history of this series and how a year ago at this time we were just learning about the new coming version of Angular. It was called Angular 2 at the time. But this year, a lot of us out there in industry are trying to figure out how are we going to get our production apps upgraded. Now that Angular's been out there and we've been hearing about it for a while, we may have been playing around with it on the side. We want to get our applications upgraded. So then we turned our attention to the AngularJS and Angular concepts. So we wanted to understand from an AngularJS perspective, which we're very familiar with, how do these new concepts that we've heard about and how do they compare, and where are the similarities, where are the differences, and what's gone and what's new? So we did kind of a side-by-side comparison of those concepts to build a foundation on which we could understand both of these different code bases as we try to bring them together during this transition. And then last week, we talked about the new tools and some of the other aspects of the Angular development environment. We now know that we're going to have to start using TypeScript, and in fact, it's beneficial to do so as a developer. Plus, we talked about the Angular CLI, which is a command line tool for Angular that really helps expedite Angular development. So today, we want to focus or turn our attention from the external development environment that we're going to use in Angular towards our inward environment. So how do we think about applications in general, and how do we need to start to transition and change the way we assemble and build mental models for our applications as we move them into an Angular mode from the AngularJS world that we're familiar with. To do that, we're going to start by reviewing exactly how is it that we view AngularJS application structure and architecture now. Then we'll talk about the component architecture, which you've probably heard about. You may not know some of the details yet, and you might not feel comfortable using it yet, but we're going to talk about that architecture and some of its benefits, some of its key characteristics. Then we want to look at how do we start to refactor some of the AngularJS applications toward that component architecture. It turns out we can actually do that using some tactics in our existing AngularJS code. Then we want to talk about this helper method that was introduced in AngularJS 1.5, the component helper method, which further supports this transition into a component type architecture. And this would be beneficial to use even if you're not planning on upgrading your code base. And lastly, we want to discuss some of the additional things that you could do to your AngularJS code base to prepare it for an upgrade. So first we want to review how we think of our AngularJS applications today. And I wanted to mention why there are these changes. Why do we have all these dramatic changes conceptually, even in how we're putting together our applications? And I thought of this legendary quote from this famous hockey player, Wayne Gretzky, who was once asked by a reporter, you know, how is it that you're so good? He was a prolific goal scorer, and his answer was that he doesn't skate to where the puck is, he skates to where the puck is going. So he's anticipating where the puck is going. And this is kind of what the Angular team was doing when they designed and released Angular. Angular is highly targeted around these emerging concept of web components. And web components are the future of the way the web is going to be published over the internet. It's a set of features that are being added to the HTML and DOM specs to allow for the creation of reusable pieces in web documents and web applications. So those specifications are emerging in these four areas. The first is custom elements, and that consists of some APIs that you could use to define new HTML elements. Next, they have some HTML templates. And this is really the addition of a template tag that is somewhat inert. It doesn't have any built-in functionality. So it provides almost a placeholder where you could place your own type of functionality in there. The next is the shadow DOM. So that gives you the ability to encapsulate some part of your DOM and its styling, right? So you avoid those collisions that are inevitable when you start working on growing front-end teams. And then lastly, these HTML imports. So these would be methods for injecting HTML documents into other HTML documents. This would be similar to how we do with code when we're including or importing external source code files. So imagine being able to do that within an HTML file. And those are the things that are being developed currently. So Angular was designed to fit into these standards, to give us some of the ability to do these things today before these new standards are official and complete. So what is application structure? How do we think about application structure? And the way I think of it is, it's the way that we organize our source code into files and folders, but it's also the way that the various parts of the source code are assigned their responsibilities and are combined to fulfill the overall requirements of the application. Now, ideally, the organization of that source code in the programming languages, the files, the folders, ideally that supports a good understanding of the application's purpose and the feature set just by reading that source code, because really good application structure, good architecture is typically most evident when we as developers attempt to read source code and we can understand it and we know where to extend functionality. And why is that even worth consideration? Well, it provides that strength. It provides that a foundation onto which to build further and to maintain. It brings power in the predictability of knowing where certain code comes or where it should be placed when you have new features or where there might be bugs that are reported. Where do you even go to work on them, right? So you can save a lot of time with a good application structure and architecture in just being able to get to those places as developers quickly. And then in general, a good structure, a good architecture improves the overall quality. You know, so with those clear assignments to files and file types, it's clear where functionality belongs and where certain behaviors and certain things should be placed for during the maintenance phase of any application. So I want to ask our panelists how they view application structure and architecture. And let me start with Bonnie. Bonnie, how do you see application structure and architecture?
For me personally, I learned it backwards because I learned AngularJS before I learned architecture. I didn't even know what architecture was, right? When I first started doing AngularJS, I was working on a pretty small application in a big company. And once I started implementing the Angular, it was cool. And especially at that time, it was back in 2013, this was stuff that, you know, two-way data binding, really fast single-page applications. So next thing I know, this small assignment that I had been given became a big assignment, and more departments wanted to use it, and they wanted more features. And then next thing you knew, it just grew and grew and grew. And that's kind of how I learned architecture backwards, because I built this small thing without thinking about any of that, you know, what was going to happen when it grew. And then it grew, and then I kind of painted myself into a corner in like 4 different places. So yeah, so for me, I learned it backwards. And then later I understood more, and I went into the Gang of Four, the design patterns, and really understanding how to structure the data to keep it all neat and clean. But for me in the beginning, it was not there. So now I know that you have to have all that planned out, and you have to think about scaling beforehand. But yeah, back then I didn't know anything about that. What about David? David, are you're doing huge stuff at Thomson Routers? So
yeah, we're doing huge stuff. I'm just gonna leave it at that. We're doing huge stuff. Just put that on my tagline. So yeah, it's a great question. I love this question because it harkens back to my original understanding of Angular and one of the challenges that we tried to solve early on. We were very fortunate in that we have an extremely talented user experience group. And what that means is we have a group of designers that will produce wireframes for us. And so a team that's going to go break ground on a refresh, migration to front end, new module, new something or other, they're partnered with a designer that will build for them an elegant, wonderful thing, something that I can't do. I will build you a kick butt, battleship gray form, all rectangles that scales and is fast, but in terms of Bezier curves and pearlescent colors, you're not going to get that from me. So we would get these wireframes, and the teams are in the process of converting to Angular, learning Angular at the same time, and they start freaking out, going, how am I going to do this? I've got one of my better examples is the File Explorer in Windows. I've got 2 panels on the page that need to interact with each other. How do I do that in Angular? That one's a good example. It's got a slider and a couple of things, but they're static. What happens when you click on a given item in the navigation piece and the content on the other side changes completely? So how do we do that? That was sort of the original conversation that led us to the UI router, right? The existing Angular router was great and served well to explain us what a multiple concept of nested hierarchical views and sibling views was not supported. And so diving into that thing and starting to get into the concepts of nested hierarchical views using states was really sort of the beginning of my understanding of an Angular applications architecture. It doesn't address services. That's a different concept. But I'm delighted to say that as we started to understand this, we got much more in the habit of working with views and controllers combined as a state, right? And so the states would have natural hierarchy, pass parameters through state params, and give us a good solid binding option. And then we would go and use, early days we'd use watch and try really hard not to, but we would. and then eventing, and then ultimately we started to really grasp and embrace the concept of services, to have services communicate through the various aspects. We could use scope, and we did in some cases, certainly with directive binding, but we're moving to a more of a scoped or service-oriented approach. Helped us immeasurably when the component piece came out. Right, we were already learning Angular 2. They backported the component in Angular 2 into Angular 1.5 as basically a specialized directive that gives you the atomic and granular ability to compose an application out of components. So long story short, we had some really complex pictures that we had to create, and that really helped us start to think in terms of composition, and then how to flow the data through eventing and then ultimately services. And that, of course, is the foundation for Angular 2. So we came to the same conclusion in AngularJS that the Angular team did on their own, and then we were delighted to see that we'd all kind of come to the same place.
I just like putting everything on the root scope. That pretty much solved every problem ever. Just put it on the root scope. It'll be fine.
I just declared as a global variable. And I should comment, this is one of the things that I was going to mention earlier. We were on Bower for a very long time. We still are for some stuff. We're migrating off to NPM. But I hadn't realized, because we were using Bower for our own internal distribution mechanisms. We have libraries that we share internally. I hadn't realized that the UI router library had sort of bifurcated. And so it had stopped growing on Bower and lived on in NPM. And because we weren't using NPM to deliver our components, we missed out on some of the newer versions and flavors. In particular, something that Stephen Fluin called my attention to when I was showing him, I was asking him to do a code review on the NG Rosetta piece, and he said, why aren't you mapping your states to a component instead of a template? I was cheating, right? I was using a template that was the component. All I did was declare, bracket component name, close bracket. That was effectively the same thing, but he's like, use the component property. And of course, there wasn't one at the time on the version in Bower. So we realized we were missing some stuff. That goes a long way, again, towards helping that composition, using a component and then using, in our case, for AngularJS UI router, mapping to a component property. That's almost equivalent to using Angular 4.
Cool.
I'll just say that I had a similar experience to Bonnie, where I basically used Angular at this financial company a few years ago as a really fancy version of jQuery, where purely we were just using it for the sake of the two-way data binding, and it made everybody ooh and ah. And so AngularJS kind of was created in this old world of just maybe one layer of abstraction above jQuery, where you could pretty much just use it to control data. It wasn't really like a object-oriented kind of thing, or like using a lot of modules or any sort of fancy tooling. And that's part of the big appeal of AngularJS still, is that you can shove it inside of like MVC with .NET, or you could use it here at a different part. Whereas nowadays we have these frameworks like Angular and React that are more like applications with these different layers of abstraction above it. And so there is a shift in your mindset of going from sort of like, I'm just using this framework to display and manipulate data on the page, to like David mentioned, state management and module loading and things like that are much like higher level concepts of programming. And so there is sort of a mental adjustment that you have going between the two, but it's definitely doable, and it's a heck of a lot better when you make the leap. It's a lot more enjoyable to be in the new world than the old world.
Right.
Great.
Sometimes it's hard to make that leap. I started with that little application, and I started using like the ng repeat, and then they thought I was really smart, and they were like super impressed because it was so cool. And they were like, Bonnie, do this, Bonnie, do this. And all of a sudden, like, I was in way over my head. Like, y'all don't realize that, like, it's Angular that's really cool. I just do that. But.
Yep. We found when we first started teaching the AngularJS boot camps that we expected to go in and find all these front-end developers looking to use a new framework, but really it was a whole bunch of really smart back-end developers who have never done any kind of client-side architecture. Right. They've been thrown this really cool framework without a real strict architecture of how to use it. So everybody kind of came up with their own way to, create a sane application. And a lot of people went a lot of different directions and came up with something really cool.
That is interesting. Cool. Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate your input on that. I'm going to go ahead and continue on. So, early web application structure. So let's think about, maybe 10 or more years ago. When we were building web applications or websites, really we just had the mix of technologies of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and essentially whichever of those could produce the effect you wanted, you'd use. And then we began to layer in libraries like jQuery to bring more rich user interfaces to our web applications. We'd build these applications where the behavior is provided by JavaScript, but perhaps the styling is handled by jQuery or even CSS or whatever, right? So that could create a maintenance nightmare, right? Every developer had his or her own ideas of how to implement some kind of functionality, and that would lead to an array of approaches, and special attention would be needed for every application to either maintain it or to learn how to use it or to write a new one. So there wasn't much structure at all in the early days of web application creation. And then we have these modern web frameworks that came along, and these started to introduce some patterns, at least some of those design patterns, to help guide our implementation. And that helped, right? So we could bring the concept of model view controller to the user interface, and it would make it easier to build some of these applications and use those proven software engineering principles to create our user interfaces. But how is it that we view AngularJS applications? Certainly when I started with AngularJS, I viewed it largely by its components, its Angular element type components, right? So when I learned AngularJS, it had its own terminology, and I kind of learned about those terms one by one and put them together to create my application. So I began to view my AngularJS apps as a set of factories and services and the controllers, and put all that together in a module, and maybe if I'm brave, I create a custom directive to invent my own tag with some reusable behavior, right? And the result of that is this scope hierarchy, which kind of mimicked the all too familiar DOM hierarchy, but introduces some complexity because there's this new idea of this scope object, and with this prototypical inheritance, we'd have to really be aware of how is data shared from scope to scope, and how does it behave as you nest further and further down your DOM structure. And then the application model was bound through this magical two-way binding, right? Which certainly was great initially. That just wasn't a lot of thinking about how do we make sure the view is going to update after we change the data, right? We know that Angular is going to take care of that. It doesn't really matter where we're changing the data. We know that it will be reflected in the view because of that. But that actually turned out to be a big problem, and it created this concept of scope soup. And because any data can be changed from anywhere, as developers and as application begins to scale, it became really hard and really difficult to determine the source of data changes. So we'd have strange behavior pop up in our applications, and it would be very painful to try to figure out, well, what triggered it? Because there's so many different areas in our application that could potentially have changed and led to that result, that it's very challenging to figure out and very time-consuming to figure out how that change occurred. So all the functionality was there, but it becomes unclear how the parts kind of fit together. And it's similar to this picture here, where this is a functioning system. We have an incoming line and it's outgoing somewhere. So you have your input and output, but it would be very time consuming to figure out, to actually trace the route of a signal from one point to the other, right? So we know it works, but it's going to take a lot of time just to figure out, if we need to, how something flows through that interchange point. And I think that's similar to what we experience when we're trying to discover where data changes occurred when we're relying simply on two-way binding. And there are some signs of scope soup that you can look for in your applications, especially in your templates. These signs were pointed out by Tero Parviainen. He's got a lot of great material online, some articles and some YouTube videos on scope soup. Feel free to search that out. You'll find some helpful material there in understanding this concept. But what he says is that signs of scope soup include lots of ng controller references and ng include. And then you also have uneven pairings of controller to template. So if you have one template and it has a main controller, and then it further, maybe a few children down, it has some child controller controlling some other aspect of that same template, that would be an example of this uneven controller to template pairing. If you have a lot of data sharing via scope inheritance, that's another sign. And then if you're just updating the state of your application in many different locations or throughout your application, that's another sign that you've got this scope soup scenario in your application. And in that scenario, it becomes hard to see the forest through the trees, right? So just like with a telephone pole example or power line example there, the system may work, but it's difficult to see clearly how things are fitting together and how things flow through the system. So the solution to that is, or the transition, the change in thinking just in the modern front-end development world is this component architecture. And the component architecture revolves around this concept of a tree of components where it's very easy to follow your data, certainly, and just your views in general from their topmost root point down through this tree to some kind of a grandchild node within the tree. So that looks like this in an application. And the characteristic of a component-based architecture is that the entire application is a tree of components. So you cannot have anything visible without at least one component. And then that component has children, and that component has its own children, and so on until you build out this entire tree from top down. And what that allows you to do is essentially de-render any part of the tree at any given time. So if you have a dashboard maybe, or a console like this one, and you have a listing of programs, your topmost component can actually control, well, which part of the tree should appear based on what the user has selected. So another key characteristic of component-based architecture is one-directional data flow. And this is where there's a significant shift from the two-way binding, data binding that's possible with AngularJS. So with two-way data binding, we know that data could change from a sibling node, from a parent node, from a child node. Any of that could occur. But with one-directional data flow, it's just like this water flowing down these cascades. That water can only flow through the channels that have been provided, through in between these rocks, right? So in our component-based architecture, our data can only flow from top down, that tree, and it can only do so in the routes that we have specified through those components. So this leads to a very helpful scenario where your data has a very predictable flow from parent to child. It's very easy to diagnose where a state change occurred because it can only occur somewhere up the chain of components. And large applications benefit from the clarity that comes from that kind of design because you can easily find that. And when you think about components, there are really 2 to 3 different types of components. The first is stateless, and those are also called dumb or pure or presentation components. And the next is called stateful, and those are also referred to as smart components or business components or even container components. And the last would be something called maybe a view component, which is also known as a router component. This might be like one of those top level components. So for a dumb component or a presentation component, the characteristics of that type of component is that it doesn't do any data manipulation on its own. It receives any data that affects how it presents itself from its parent, its immediate parent. Can't get it from a grandparent. It has to receive it from its immediate parent. And then if it has some data or some thing that it needs to communicate to the rest of the application, it has to emit that information or that data through an event. So an example of this might be some kind of a, let's say a home monitoring system or app on your phone, and maybe you're watching the state of a door at your house, and you want to report or know whether that door is open or closed. You can have a dumb component that just shows that state. It can't change the state, right? Obviously, somebody would have to physically be there to close the door, but a dumb component could be used simply to display whether or not that door is currently open or closed. The next type of component, the smart component or container component, does actually have information about the data. It can do data manipulation. It owns that data. It has a responsibility to modify it. And typically it doesn't provide much user interaction at all, if at all. Its job really is to render other components that provide that user interaction. And it's assigned the responsibility of simply managing that data. So an example of this might be some kind of component that fetches a list of contacts, and it may do that still through a service, right? But this is a component part of it, so the visible part of it. This component would have the responsibility to contact the service, get that list of contacts as an array, and then simply pass that array to its child that could then display that array of contacts. And the last type of component is a view or a router component, and this is also a component that's just composed of others. It knows about the router, and it can dynamically generate or hide or show certain parts of the component tree. So these are the ones kind of at the top level of your application that would provide those entry points. So another key characteristic of a component architecture is this data in, events out philosophy. And I mentioned this briefly when I talked about dumb components. And this is really a big transition, certainly was for me when I started using component architecture in my AngularJS applications, because a lot of my AngularJS code was void of this idea. I did not isolate and ensure that data was only being displayed that was input from an output channel, and that I was requesting data changes through an events output loop. But this is something that we can start to practice in AngularJS to prepare for Angular. So let's take a look at how we can start to refactor AngularJS around these component ideas. To do that, we'll need to get familiar with some of the component anti-patterns that are common to AngularJS. And then we'll try to use directives to organize the code into something that's more fitting of a component architecture, something that's closer to it. And then we'll apply this intentional component binding patterns to make sure we're doing that data in, events out approach. So to convert from this scope soup to components, we start by identifying candidates through our code that we can refactor. So we'll look for ng includes, and we'll look for those DOM sections that are bound to some ng controller. And we also look for large blocks of HTML. And then we can create components out of that existing code by doing a few things. The first is to name all the controllers with controller aliasing. And you may have already done this. This idea has been around for a while. But if you haven't done this, I'd definitely recommend that you start by making sure you have an alias for all of your controllers. And then we can change those ng includes to component directives and specify those bindings on the components and declare any output events that we need to use to mutate the state. So let's talk through an example of what that would look like. So let's say we have this project controller, this part of our app here where we simply attach, and in this first part, I'm just going to show you this controller aliasing. So when we first started using AngularJS, we used the $scope object to bind our application model to the views. And this is an example of how we did that up here on the top. We'd have a project controller, and we would attach our projects array directly to that controller. And then we just use an ng repeat or something to display those. But when we use controller aliasing, we assign some label, some alias to the controller object so it can be attached to that scope, and we'll have a little bit better idea of where that data is coming from, where that part of our DOM is being controlled. So let's show an example of how we can create a component. So let's say we need to replace this ng include here with some kind of a component directive. So we have this template external here called project task, and it just shows maybe a project name. And to do that, we invent a project task directive and give it an inherited scope from its parent, because that's how the original one is behaving, right? And we simply point it to that HTML template that we already have. And then by doing that, we've actually created this custom directive, this custom tag called project task at the bottom of these images here. And next we want to move any of those top level template controllers into that directive. So it's likely that at the top of this, most of the time when you have an ng include, you're going to have some top level controller assigned to manage the state of that part of your DOM. And so what we want to do is shift that into the directive, and we can do that just by using the directive definition properties keys that are available to us already. So we've just got our controller and controller as there, and really the other two elements are still there. We're still pointing the same template, and we've got our inherited scope. And then lastly, we want to organize those files into their own folder. And this is just going to help us from an application structure perspective find all of the code that's related to this project task. So we've created a list, we've created a folder called components, and we've gone ahead and bunched together the 3 files that we've used to create a component to replace our ng include. We've bunched those into their own folder now. And then we would repeat those steps for any of those mid-template ng controllers. So we'd move that markup to its own template. We create that component directive, adopt that controller into the directive, and then bundle that code into its own component folder. And then next we need to think about the data flow. So we want to look for our component templates for expressions that reference something that should not be owned by the component. And this is an example of that. So let's say we have our project task, and it has a flag, show hide flag, that will control whether or not that task is visible or not. And in this case, we have this main controller that is controlling or dictating the state of that ng-show attribute. And main controller is not part of our project task directive. So what we need to do is we need to create an input binding for that flag so that the parent controller, that main controller, can signal to our new component directive whether or not it should be visible or not. And we do that simply by adding this bind to controller and adding a two-way binding to a property called visible. We've still got the same template, same controller, inherited scope. All we've done is add in an input binding. And then to use that, we simply update our component template with this internal reference to the property that's owned by the component. So the new component owns a property called visible. And then in our index.html down there at the bottom, we can see that the main controller that is controlling the hosting environment for our project task component can control this input. It can toggle it on and off, and our project task component will function entirely independent of where it's placed. Next, we want to talk about data flowing out of our template. So let's say we have a button on our project task component that will allow someone to delete a task. And just like with our prior example, let's say that initially that button is controlled or linked to a method that's on the hosting controller, hosting templates controller. So this main controller delete task, we know is not owned by this component because this component has an alias of CTRL. So what we do is we introduce an output binding to allow that external environment to receive information from our project task component. We do that just by adding this on delete, and this output binding is done with an ampersand. And then we change our index.html to add in another attribute to map to our main controller's delete task. So now we have a way for our project task component to request that the main controller execute the delete task anytime it is invoked. But we're able to replace this part, this ng-click main control.delete task can be replaced with ctrl dot on delete, and that will output that to its parent. Then the last thing we can do to make sure we've got a completely independent unit, completely independent component is to isolate the scope. So it's really helpful to do this process in these phases because it will allow you to ensure that you're not losing any functionality as you make those earlier changes. So make changes, make sure you retain that inherited scope until you're certain that all your functionality is still there once introducing your component, and then at the end isolate your scope by declaring an isolate scope binding here. Another thing that occurs when we have these components, we have scope soup, is this shared mutable state. So let's say we have a project task list directive, and we've got this component here, directive component, where we are inputting a list or collection of tasks, and we're passing that list of tasks in from the external environment. You can see on the index.html. But then within the project task list component template itself, we are removing the task. So typically that might look like this, where we are immediately manipulating the project tasks collection that was passed into this component. And that's a problem, right? Because that collection was given to this component as an input, right? It really shouldn't have any business manipulating the state of that collection itself. As a DOM or a presentation component, it should defer that responsibility to whoever provided the list to it. In reality, this kind of a function should simply be making requests to delete a particular task. And then it's up to the the component that manages that collection to decide whether or not to actually remove an item or not from the array. So what that could look like after refactoring would be something like this, where we use an output binding locally to communicate to the parent component that we request the removal of a particular task. And this would look like this in the environment that that particular component is placed. Another nice thing that the AngularJS framework provides for us was introduced in version 1.5. So far, we've talked about how to create components using the component directive method or using directive definition objects within AngularJS. And we can continue to do that. But one of the things that's really neat we can use to really get our code in a position that's as close to Angular as possible prior to its final upgrade is using this component helper method that was introduced. It's available in 1.5 and higher. And really what it is a special kind of directive. It creates a special kind of directive. And that special kind of directive has the qualities that a directive has to have to be a component. And that's really a template and a controller. So in AngularJS, we know we can create behavioral type directives that don't necessarily have a template, and those would not be good candidates to convert into a component, because a component should represent something that has some view involved. It has some display aspect to it, even if it's just as a host for other components that actually render content to the screen. But this component helper method eliminates some of the complexities that we've become familiar with in AngularJS with the scope and trying to figure out, do we have an isolate scope or inherited scope? So instead, it gives us this bindings property. And with that bindings, it gives us a new feature that's called one-way bindings. So we indicate one-way bindings with this less than sign here. So with component directives, we were using the two-way binding indicator. And of course, that opens us up still to some risk of something being manipulated that we hadn't accounted for. But with one-way bindings that are possible by using this 1.5 component helper, we can make sure that won't happen. So we'll see a little bit on this in the next slide or a little bit later. We still have the other types of bindings that are available to you as well. You can still use two-way bindings here if you like, but this one-way binding is really helpful and will really put you in a position to transition to Angular. And then they also provide this implicit controller aliasing. So in your templates for components that you build with this helper method, they'll give you a default $CTRL. So you can use that, and if you don't want to invent your own alias for your components. Then there's also some lifecycle methods that are introduced with this, and these are also parts are very well aligned with what is possible and available to you when you move to Angular. These are pretty handy. So there's a $on_init lifecycle, which is called when all those bindings are in place, so you can be assured that your input data is present. And it's a good place to put any kind of initialization code. I know with my AngularJS code early on, I'd find myself often trying to recall or figure out where should I put all of my initialization code, because I'd spend all the time, the constructor method itself would be setting up some of the functions that I was attaching to scope and some of the variables that I was attaching to scope. And then I would inevitably have some kind of initialization that didn't really fit quite with that. And I wasn't sure if I should write my own init function and then bump that down to the bottom of my constructor method or what? Well, this $sign on init makes that really easy to figure out where I should place that kind of code. And then there's also a $sign on destroy, which can be called or is called whenever the component is destroyed. And this is a great place to clean up any resources or to, for instance, stop any watches that you have in effect. That's a good place to do that as well. And then lastly, the onChanges lifecycle handler is really used frequently by me. This is where you will detect and process any kind of input bindings that have changed, whether two-way, I think, or whether one-way, but most of my bindings are one-way now, and that looks like this. So if we're to set up a onChanges handler for this project task detail component, we will receive, the framework will provide us with this changes object, and that changes object will have a key for anything that has changed. So if you have 4 or 5 inputs to your component, and let's say this case only one has changed, this task name, then changes.task name will be the only key that's on that changes object. So you can write your code to respond in very specific ways to only a very small set of things that need to happen in response to any particular input binding change. In addition to migrating your code towards components and then introducing your component helper method, there's also some other things we can do to prepare our AngularJS code for an upgrade. The first is to replace our factory functions with services. And this is an idea that, so first of all, I believe that there's no such thing as factories within Angular. So that's one reason why you would want to switch to services over factories. The other reason, I believe, is that in AngularJS, it's a bit difficult to wrap your head around the difference between factories and services. But the way I understand it is that a service is when Angular generates a service, when you're using the service helper method, the function that you pass in is used as a constructor function. So it will create an object and return it as a service. But when you designate or use the factory helper method, the function that you will give to Angular will simply be called, whether or not it returns something or not. And so when you use the factory function, you as a developer are responsible for returning some object. Whereas when you use the service helper method, you're assured you'll be returned an object because Angular is assuming the function that you passed it is a constructor function. And why that's most relevant when it comes to upgrading is that's how Angular works. So Angular is expecting a class, really, which has its constructor function. And so it's more closely aligned with that. If anyone else on the panel has an explanation or an idea of why it's beneficial to move from factory functions to services, go ahead and let me know. Go ahead and chime in.
Hey, did I beat you, John? Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just real quick, so one of the defining factors. So Denny, you summarized it perfectly. Thank you. The other aspect as to why it's preferable is that services can return an ES6 class, where a factory cannot.
Okay.
So if you're using TypeScript and getting all the love out of the class features,
yep,
that dovetails very nicely with the service.
Right, right. So you could start doing that with your AngularJS code before even moving to Angular.
Correct.
Right, great. Anyone else?
Yeah, David hit on exactly what I was going to say.
Okay, cool. No, that's good. Thanks, guys. The other thing we can do is to make sure we're dividing the application into one component per file. So it's lots of division, and it creates a lot of files, but these become easy to manage once we start moving towards a world with TypeScript, and certainly is what we'll see in Angular. The other thing we want to do is organize our code using the folders by feature approach. And if we can begin using TypeScript, it's worthwhile to do so. This may or may not be, this seems daunting, but again, as we covered last week, there's really some major benefits to be gained by doing this. And so I would highly encourage people to at least try to start using TypeScript in their existing AngularJS code. And then the last thing we can do is to integrate Webpack into our project to bundle files. And I can't speak to this too much. I'm using Webpack a little bit in the workplace right now, but it feels like anytime I try to do something new with it, I'm at a loss on what I need to do to make that work with Webpack. So that's still a bit of an intimidating builder for me. But anyway, it will help to use if you can, because when we move to Angular, that's the dominant build method or module loader. Any other ideas from the panel on things to do to your existing AngularJS code base to get it in the best or most close format to transition to Angular?
So yeah, you stole all my thunder. I had all these notes going. Yeah, okay, well, yeah, and then I see this slide and go, oh, okay, cool. So I'm just going to backfill a couple of things that you said with maybe a little bit more bolstering reasons or benefits to it. So let's see, the combination of TypeScript and Webpack, that's what we're standardizing on. It works beautifully. Webpack has become a well-loved thing in my world, and it's starting to propagate out into the rest of our community of some, I don't know, 80 to 100 enterprise teams. One of the things that I think is worth calling out is that typically we segregate our test files. We take our common test files and we put them down in the test folder. And the reason for that is because the build tools that we used to use would start at a given root folder and then just grab everything that's in there. And so if you left your test files in there, that could be bad. You would basically be deploying that to production. Wouldn't hurt anything, but it's bloat that you don't want. Using Webpack as a feeder for Karma allows you to keep your spec files in line with the rest of your files. So your folders by feature piece is expanded by that much more. So your unit tests stay with the source code. And if you happen to move that source code around for organizational purposes, the tests go with it. So using TypeScript for your unit tests, again, is a really good thing. It'll give you IntelliSense off of the objects. Also, when you include the Jasmine and Karma type definitions, you'll get IntelliSense off of those things too. The concept of bundling and minification, that's a whole subject in and of itself, but the concept of segregating your vendor files and then putting a cache buster on them so that they can be cached and separated. It's common that you're going to upgrade your application source code, but it is not necessarily common that you're going to upgrade your dependencies. Last year, that could have been a farcical statement considering the frequency by which Angular was being released, especially if you were sitting on 2.0 and the constant betas. But now the cadence has slowed down pretty significantly. So again, the concept of having the majority of your dependencies all cached on the browser, user takes one hit, and then everything stays in place, and just your app code is churning. That makes for a much better experience. And I think that's about all I had. You covered everything I was going to say and then some, so thank you. Good job.
Thanks to you, David. Anybody else have anything else?
Yeah, I'll say one or two things. One thing that I'm not sure if you said explicitly, but in the style guide, it was suggested that you use ifs. You wrap everything in ifs. And one important point about moving to TypeScript in Webpack is that you'll be extracting that code out and exporting it. So you'll need to learn a little bit about ES6 module exporting and importing in order to use Webpack and bundle with it and everything. So that's just another task to add as you're migrating if you've been using like the style guide with using the immediately invoked function expressions. So that can be a little bit of a challenge, especially because then if you move to TypeScript, you've got to go back and rename all your files and everything. But I would say that two things to keep in mind. One is that you don't have to go super deep with the component architecture in the beginning. You can basically just convert all your controllers over and leave everything for now. Like, you can go really deep into nesting your components and breaking things into smaller and smaller pieces, and that's great. But it's not, if you're trying to have a continuously deployable AngularJS application as you slowly migrate, which I've had to do, don't stress out about breaking everything into these tiny little pieces. You can at least just make the basic steps of like changing controllers to components, and then changing factories to services, and then moving things to TypeScript. Because the second point I'll say is that the build process is the biggest hurdle, but it's also the one with the most payoff. Once you can get your ES6 modules and TypeScript and Webpack all set up and working properly, the rest of this process is a heck of a lot easier. You're doing slow refactoring, and then utilizing ng upgrade, which we'll talk about next week, but utilizing ng upgrade, and you can do that in little pieces, one by one. So this can feel like a hugely overwhelming process, especially if it's a big application. But most of this can be done iteratively in sprints, where you're deploying something every single sprint, if need be, in a release cycle. So that's my 2 cents.
That's great. Thanks. Cool.
That's awesome. I have a couple of comments. I was going to say the same thing, and David stole my thunder, because I actually had a list of notes of things that I was going to mention, and Denny, you covered all of them, and you did a really good job, and that was perfect. So yeah, dump components, moving away from two-way data binding, that kind of thing. I think you got all of it, which is great. But one thing that I did want to mention, when I went through this process of trying to move from AngularJS to Angular and doing the, going to the dump components and breaking things into smaller files, one of the problems that I had over and over again was it worked, right? And then I try to start upgrading it and migrating it, and then it doesn't work, right? And so I'm balancing learning how to do this versus actually being productive and doing my job, which is what I'm getting paid for. So there's that pressure, right? When it's not working. When you're trying to pass data between components, that was something that I found to be difficult. When you're trying to do this and then not use the two-way data binding anymore that you've been using, because that's how we do it. That's how we did it, right? That's why we loved it so much, was that two-way data binding. It was really cool. And then trying to move away from that can be difficult and frustrating. And so the suggestion that I would give you is, if you're really struggling with that, if you're struggling with passing inputs and outputs and making those components, smaller components, talk to each other, then I would say definitely, put your head down and work through it, because your code is going to be better. And even though it's difficult as a developer, it's really structurally, architecturally, it's better in the long run to just power through it and figure out how to do that. And if you get stuck, reach out, because there are people out here. There are those of us, there are a lot of us who have been through this process, and we're happy to help you. You can tweet at us, Denny and I, and NG Houston. We can't promise that we'll help you, but we can try to help you. But yeah, I mean, if you don't figure it out, you have all these cool features like Webpack. The first time I did Webpack, it was pretty painful, but it's great, right? And if you reach out to the Webpack people, Sean Larkin and they're super, super nice, and they'll try to help. And also, one more quick thing that I wanted to mention. I know it's hard because this is open source, right? So there's not really somebody who's responsible, and we're all kind of helping each other. But if you really want to just get somebody to come in and handle this for you, there are companies out there who can help you with that. John, do you know any companies like that who can help people who are really, it gets hard because sometimes you have deadlines, right? So people who can help.
I've heard of one company. So there is a company out there called Oasis Digital at oasisdigital.com.
Oh yeah.
I don't want to turn this into just an ad for myself, but yeah, we are a consulting firm, and this is what we do. I mean, we handle startups, we handle conversions, just people having some trouble with your code, whether it's I need here's some code. I need you to do a rewrite, or maybe you just need a couple hours a week to talk to somebody and, do some pair programming. We can help you through that too. So yeah, please feel free to reach out if you need help.
Yeah, and I don't want to make people think that this is like that we're like pushing these services, because we're not, right? But there's a reason why I always reach out to the Oasis Digital guys. Also, ThoughtRam and Narwhal are really cool people, very, very smart, very helpful. But yeah, these are experts that can come in and actually look at your code and help you with it, help you with reviews. So there are a number of consulting companies out there that are popping up that are very good. Oasis Digital, ThoughtRam, and Narwhal that I know of, and I know there are probably more. And also you can, ping us, tag NG Houston on Twitter if you have questions. And like I said, I can't promise that we can help you, but we're happy to try and at least point you in the right direction. And Denny, we have more coming up for anybody who's following along. We have a couple of episodes of this. If you've missed this, we have some on our YouTube channel. And then we have, what, 2 more, Denny?
Yes. Yeah, let me get there in just a second here, Bonnie.
Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, so just to recap tonight, so we talked about this component architecture, and we see that it's very different from what is possible with the way that we have assembled our AngularJS applications. But we know that component architecture is the future of web development. It's everywhere. It's not just an Angular thing. It has a lot of traction, and for good reason, within the front-end development community. The nice thing is that we can learn and apply component architecture in AngularJS 1.4 and lower. And then if we're up on 1.5 and higher, we can use that component helper method to further transition us towards that architecture. And then there's also those other things we were just talking about that we can do to our code base to get it really prepared, well prepared for a jump to Angular. So Bonnie, what we have coming up is next week at the same time, we are going to show you how to put AngularJS right beside Angular code and run both at the same time. So this is a really powerful ability that the Angular team has given us by giving us a tool that we can use to blend or scaffold these two types of code bases together and run both of them simultaneously. And that'll support us as we iterate through our code to move it from AngularJS to Angular. So that's next week. That's our Angular alongside AngularJS. And then in 2 weeks, on October 3rd, we're going to walk through some example migrations. And we're going to feature the NG Rosetta project that our panelist David Owen was responsible for. And that's a nice repository that's out there that you can look at and study, and shows you exactly how they have already transformed an AngularJS code base into Angular. So that'll be 2 weeks from tonight.
That's awesome. Thank you, Denny.
My pleasure. Thank you all.
As usual, that was a great presentation, and that was a lot of detail, and I hope that's super helpful. And also for people watching, if you come back while we're live streaming next week and you have questions, and you're welcome to jump into the YouTube channel and ask questions in the chat, and we'll try to help you. And I think, Sam, John, did you guys have anything more that you wanted to add tonight? Sam, you're going to be here next week, right?
Yeah, I'm going to be giving a presentation on NG Upgrade. So I would just say if anybody does want to tweet questions as I'm preparing, I can integrate those into the talk. So either at NG Houston or at me personally, it's just at Sam Julian.
Awesome. Well, we'll look forward to having you next week. And John, I'm glad that you were. We didn't give you much time to talk tonight. So
I feel like I didn't get to contribute much. So yeah, thanks for having me. We had a fantastic panel, so I didn't. There wasn't a whole lot to add, but I hope to be back soon.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would be great to have you on more panels going forward. I have kind of a list rotating, so I need to get you on the list and start having you come in more. But yeah, you're always welcome to join us, and it's always great to have the whole, like, I've gotten pretty much at least one person from Oasis Digital, like, on every panel, because you guys are always great panelists. So I appreciate you joining us. And Denny, I really appreciate you doing all this work and putting all this stuff together. This is a really great, I think I'm hoping it helps a lot of people who are trying to kind of struggle with what we've been through.
Yep, I hope so too.
All right. Well, I think that's it for tonight, guys. Thank you so much again for joining us, and we will see you guys next week.